For those that missed last year, the hit song lists that I do aren't the only January tradition I kind of started establishing on my channel that year. For those who don't know, today's my birthday, and one way I decide to celebrate as of last year is to review something from the year that I was born, 1987. Now, last year, I reviewed Fantasy G.I. Joe, basically. This year, I'm going to go a little bit of a different route. And I think, considering what happened last year, considering some of the stuff that was going on, this one was actually pretty obvious.
I feel like a world where we have Doctor Who as Scrooge McDucking fuck is the proper dimension.
But this seems like a really good time to figure out why we have this reboot. And I'm not just talking about, like, why we enjoyed the show in the first place. I'm looking at why the original show was good and the reasons that it could use an update as well. I'm going to be looking specifically at the first 5 episodes. There's like 60 or 80 episodes that came out in 1987, but I mean, I only did like 3 episodes of Visionaries, so it kind of makes sense. Besides, these first 5 episodes also are an overarching narrative, so that matches with what I tend to do. And there's also the fact that they debuted on the same day, so it seems very fitting. I'm going to be comparing these to the first double-length episode from the reboot. I'll explain a little bit why this comparison is the way I'm going near the end. But before we get there, I think we pretty much all know where I'm going to need to start.
This is considered to be one of the best opening themes of all time.
And you know what? I would actually kind of be inclined to agree. There's ones that I like a little bit better, but that comes down to subjectivity at the end of the day, and whether I'm as nostalgic for this as other things. So, you know, it is what it is. Now, the fact of the matter is that, yeah, it's really good, and I understand why the 2017 reboot version wouldn't really touch it very much, although I will say that the vocals on the new version are a little bit less energetic, and that's slightly disappointing. But there is one thing. There is one thing in the original theme that really strikes me as odd. Not ponytails or Capitan tails, no DuckTales. Woo! Yeah, I've seen parodies of TV themes that seem to feel the need to, like, where the joke is that they go on for so long that they start having to describe what the show isn't because they run out of things to describe what the show is. Yeah, I wasn't expecting that in a... Well, I know this theme already, but yeah, I wouldn't say that it's a good thing when it's done in an actual theme. I mean, to be fair, it's kind of ingrained into the theme at this point, so it's kind of fine, but that doesn't really take away from the fact that it is a negative aspect. Alright, well, now that I'm done with the thing that's probably going to get me the most hate, let's actually talk about the series proper.
We all know the iconic dive into the money pit, and that serves as a perfect introduction to Scrooge in the very first scene of the original show.
And I do feel like the whole first minute of this episode does a good job of introducing Uncle Scrooge. Or rather, the concept of Uncle Scrooge that gets ignored after about 1, maybe 2 episodes.
Although the origins of the Scrooge McDuck concept is that of a duck version of Ebenezer Scrooge, in the show itself he's much more of an intrepid treasure hunter.
Which, to be fair, it's not like those things are mutually exclusive, but I do feel like this is something that the original version kind of just throws at us instead of giving us the opportunity to view this as a complexity in the character. And I do feel like this is to the detriment of the narrative of the original, and it's something that the reboot outright fixes.
The reboot outright calls Scrooge a famous adventurer right from the beginning and shows us him lamenting his age.
Which kind of actually modernizes the concept in a timeless sort of way, if that makes sense, and makes it work a lot better.
The fact that the money pit swimming scene occurs is more of a confirmation that he's still the same badass he used to be.
Really wouldn't have worked in the original at all. But I do feel like introducing this idea that he was once much more adventurous in his youth, and he's getting back to that point by doing what he's doing now, kind of does serve to the original pretty well if they were to handle it like that a little bit more. And a little bit sooner.
We do get a brief introduction to Donald as well, although the real important introduction here is the nephews, Huey, Dewey, and Louie.
And I'm not gonna lie, they're pretty interchangeable in the original series. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's certainly a style of writing where treating characters that are very similar to each other, kind of in a group, as one individual character works, especially when you have like a bigger ensemble cast, and you sort of need to trim the fat a little bit in that direction. However, I will say this, it does seem like something where the reboot wanted the boys to be a little bit more individual in personality. And I'll get there. I'll get to why I feel that this has happened and why it's a good thing. But first I want to point something about the lack of individuality from the boys that does actually kind of hurt the show. In fact, I'm kind of doing both at once, talking about why the reboot does it good and the original could have been better because of this. I'll explain it.
It's around this point where we get introduced to the initial dynamic of animosity between the nephews and Scrooge.
Which is kind of where the problem is. Namely, that the dynamic seems to shift with, from my perspective, not a whole lot of rhyme or reason.
First, both of them don't really like each other at all, but then it seems like the nephews want to hang out with Scrooge more for some reason. But then the table flips with Scrooge liking them, but them not liking Scrooge.
But although the last two changes in dynamic make a little more sense, one of them like a single scene after the last one I was talking about, mind you, there's more complex reasons why I have problems with those. So I'll address those later when I have a little bit more time to talk about them. So, the thing is, treating the boys individually is part of what makes the reboot able to handle this dynamic better.
Not only do the shifts in perspective for the characters serve more of an arc rather than a wildly swinging pendulum, but the individual personalities, especially Dewey's, allow for more dynamic arrangements to occur.
Thereby taking a more individualistic view of the nephews and using that in order to tell a more complex story in less time.
So, about a third of the way through the episode, we get a kind of slick introduction to the Beagle Boys.
And I gotta give credit to this. Like, he mentions them, as soon as we're thinking, who are those people that you brought up, we see the people he brought up. It's almost like the scenes transition together really well, and I gotta give props on that one. Especially for, like, secondary comic relief villains, you know? That's a good amount of effort for someone that low on the totem pole, so to speak.
So before we get into that dynamic shift I was talking about, we have the Beagle Boys escaping prison to meet with El Capitan.
Who's gonna kind of be the main villain for these 5 episodes. He's not really gonna show up again later in the series. Although, I would argue that he could have, based on what these 5 episodes show us. Although, I mean, we'll get to some of the more intriguing elements of El Capitan in some of these later episodes. For now, let's just work with what we got.
Alright, let's get into that table flip I was talking about to give some context to the problematic shift in demeanor.
The Scrooge expresses he feels like he's being too hard on the boys, but all the boys end up hearing of that is that Scrooge is upset with them. Which, trope of convenience, it happens in media. But I do feel like this one could have worked a lot better if we'd seen that Scrooge already did care about the boys. I mean, before now, Scrooge's opinion of the boys kind of narrowed down to he wanted them out of his hair.
Scrooge will go back to hating them a scene later.
And it's based entirely on the events of one scene. A scene that contains actually another shift of dynamic and one that is not explained properly at all.
So first of all, this whole thing hinges on the boys going to the Money Pit building when they see the Beagle Boys enter it.
Which, yeah, that is kind of a weird change from what they were doing before now. Now, granted, it's not completely out of left field. They thought Scrooge didn't want them. So, in theory, it seems like, hey, these guys are trying to rob Scrooge. Maybe if we stop these guys, we'll be in his good graces. It kind of makes sense. But on the other hand, considering right before this, they were talking about trying to get Donald to take them back. I mean, it just seems like the pacing of this whole thing is kind of off.
Scrooge turning against the boys again would come off a lot more natural than this, though.
Since from his point of view, it looked like they were trying to steal from him, even though they were trying to stop the Beagle boys from stealing from him. There is one problem with that, though.
They point out that they have physical evidence that someone else was there, and this is promptly ignored.
Granted, the plot doesn't really move in the exact same direction with Scrooge and the boys now on the same page, but, you know, that doesn't mean it wouldn't have worked that way either. That and maybe come up with a better excuse, or even any excuse for Scrooge to dismiss the physical evidence.
I do feel the chase that ensues the next day with the nephews, interpolated with Scrooge publicly bringing up his nephews positively, does a good job of making up for these deficiencies.
Because even though I do think it was kind of dumb for him to not believe them so strongly, you know, there's the passage of time that kind of gives him a little bit of clarity, as well as sort of a prompt that leads him down thinking about it more. And I think it actually does, you know, do something that a lot of the rest of this episode doesn't really do. And that's give a proper transition to the thought process.
Of course, now we're going from the interpersonal drama that really isn't the reason that people like this show, to the promised danger from the theme song in the form of a slapstick adventure chase scene.
And although this is probably the weakest of the action scenes in these 5 episodes, no doubt because of how low the stakes feel, it does build up to a nice little crescendo.
With the entire candy factory getting flooded in chocolate to capture the Beagle boys in it. Yeah, you know, as you do.
And this specific incident is going to tie into the setup to the plot to the second episode. There is something that I do want to point out about this. The way they do a multi-part episode here with these 5 is a really, really good way to do it.
See, in this 5-parter, each individual episode tells a full story on its own, but the consequences of one episode directly affect the overarching narrative.
But here's the thing. It does so in such a way where it's really more so rewarding someone who's watching the entire thing as a whole, rather than punishing someone who's not.
The beginning of the reboot does this as well, with a slight regression in the arc of Scrooge trusting the boys, serving to make the second half more of a complete story on its own.
Although I would say, at the very least, the reboot does a little bit of a better job of explaining this kind of regression, although in a more subtle way, mind you, than the original did. But that does show that the reboot feels that this back and forth of trust is very much a positive to the original's narrative. And I would agree. I like the trust back and forth. I just don't like the way it was handled.
The second episode of the original is the first full-on treasure hunting episode.
And it's also the point that where they don't really try to be complex with character interaction, which kind of serves to the advantage of the show in this particular case.
Instead, we're outright focused on the action and adventure, with many of the smaller details being used to set up the bigger ones.
And something notable I want to bring out is the boat is the small wooden boat is supposed to serve as the map, and the artwork of this boat is very consistent. I do appreciate when they have that level of detail, where even when it's a background piece, it still has all of the same notes where you can pick up on the stuff just as much as the characters can.
Along with the return of El Capitan, this episode introduces us to Scrooge's business rival, Flintheart Glom Gold.
And the scene that introduces him does a really good job of introducing kind of what he's about, what his goals are, namely getting more money than Scrooge. That's pretty simple to explain. He's also a very good choice for the secondary villain of this episode, being a good villain to be able to use his own greed to accentuate the greed of El Capitan.
He does take measures throughout the episode to try and stop Scrooge from reaching the treasure,
although 1 or 2 of them are a bit...
Listen, mister, you better turn this plate around right now! It's a robot!
let's talk about how Glom Gold expects to find the gold himself, because he doesn't exactly have a map.
Because that actually has to do with the way they caught the Beagle Boys in the first episode.
Since what Glom Gold has is a chocolate imprint of the map from that candy factory flood from the first episode.
And I fucking love this.
Especially since they find a new reason to bring up how the last episode ended in the beginning of this one.
This is a really good example of how you can tell full stories and still leave a through line to be able to tell more stories on top of that, whether or not it involves leaving stuff a mystery or not.
The episode ends with Glom Gold and El Capitan getting the upper hand until Glom Gold tosses Scrooge a single coin and the two start fighting.
Which I find to be very interesting on a number of levels. Glom Gold is showing just how much of a bastard he is. Because as the old saying goes, a weak show of mercy is the greatest act of cruelty. And that's exactly what Glom Gold is doing here. However, that weak act of mercy also happens to trigger El Capitan's obsession with the treasure, thus forming Glom Gold's own hubris on, at the very least, the first level.
Funny thing is that the two of them wind up sinking the ship and Scrooge wins the money-making challenge since he has the one coin.
So not only does hubris hit both of our villains, it hits Glom Gold really hard. Overall, I'd say that this is probably my favorite of these initial 5 episodes, and it seems to be the one that has the most direct inspiration for what goes on in the reboot's beginning. Oh, that's not to say, of course, that I wouldn't want to see the reboot's version of the rest of this either, because I would.
The coin is very important to the next 3 episodes as it serves as the evidence that leads to the Temple of the Golden Sun.
Which is the prime reason for, well, the plot of the next 3 episodes. We do get a few character introductions that I kind of do need to go over, but first I want to talk about Donald's return in this episode, because this is another problem I see with the original that I feel the reboot fixes.
See, here Donald really just serves as a generic third wheel outside of the slapstick routine, which is a role that could have easily been played by Gyro Gearloose.
An inventor introduced for a couple of seconds and then mostly ignored. Actually, pretty much entirely ignored. Look, I'm not saying that Donald Duck isn't great. It's not cool. But I do feel like Donald in this series is better served being somewhat of a background character. And I also feel like Gearloose could have used a little bit more of the spotlight. The two kind of serve a little bit of a bumbling comic relief role. And either one of them could have done that on this adventure. And I feel like quality of characters is better than quantity. I think Donald Duck works much better in this show as a background element than a foreground element. And I think Gearloose serves better as a foreground element to this show. That way you don't have to come up with these weird contrived reasons for him to show up, you know what I mean? Because he's already there.
Granted, the reboot kind of goes back to the source comics with Donald's role in the series.
So this is something that the beginning of the reboot definitely wanted to address. Gearloose doesn't really show up until later on in the series, although, honestly, like I said, quality over quantity. I would rather have Gearloose only show up when it matters. Even though I do like the character, I would rather have him only show up when he matters, rather than have his introduction be entirely cursory. Of course, you know, then there's the other character that got introduced in this episode. Nah, I'm just playing, he's cool. But seriously, in that particular shot, he looks unintentionally terrifying. And I'm getting flashbacks of a pizzeria for some reason.
Launchpad McQuack is a pilot with a penchant for crashing planes.
And I know tons of people who like Launchpad, including myself. I'm more familiar with Launchpad from Darkwing Duck, but I will say this. He is a great sort of comedic doofus. He's not so stupid that he's annoying. He's just stupid enough, and he has some competence to go with the, you know, generally less streetwise, so to speak, demeanor. I don't really know how to describe it. He's like dumb in the areas where he should be dumb, and he's smart in the areas where he should be smart. He has mental deficiencies that makes sense.
The modern version of the character absolutely does both of the older versions justice, too.
So you can easily tell that this is one of the central characters that they really felt the need to get right. As a matter of fact, I do think I like the reboot version better than DuckTales Launchpad, but not as much as Darkwing Duck Launchpad, although I feel like I'll end up talking about that at some point later.
This episode also introduces Miss Beakley and Webigail Vanderduck.
And although they really don't play a big role until episode 4, I'm willing to say this much, I'm not a fan.
This episode's plot involves Scrooge going to the Andes to find someone who has another golden sun coin.
And as luck would have it, he also has one half of the map to the Temple of the Golden Sun. Convenient.
Scrooge winds up rafting down a river to find the other half of the map.
But that more so serves as a lead-in to episode 4. Before we get to that point, the thing I do want to talk about a little bit more from episode 3 is the guy who has the other coin.
Apparently, he's descended from a conquistador who found the temple, who was left on the island by a suspiciously familiar-looking captain.
Who's actually El Capitan 400 years prior. You're probably wondering why he's still alive. I'm not a big fan of the explanation.
Episode 4 is absolutely my least favorite episode of the bunch.
But that doesn't mean it's outright a bad episode. The tone of this one feels kind of iffy. I think part of it is that it feels somewhat like one of your typical power of friendship sort of episode. I'm not saying that it skews, too hard in that direction where... Not that that would necessarily be a problem, because I have liked episodes that are more power of friendship type of affairs. But let's just say the aspects of a power of friendship thing that this episode tends to gravitate towards are the annoying ones. The goddamn annoying ones.
The central conflict of this episode is the nephews growing to like Miss Beakley and Webby more.
And although I can certainly see the reason why they wind up liking Miss Beakley more, doesn't mean I don't have a problem with her character.
Look, I'm not saying that an ensemble cast doesn't need a character that's the voice of reason when other characters are unreasonable.
But not only do I already tend to prefer when the voice of reason role sort of shifts from character to character depending on the situation, thus allowing your voice of reason to still have social flaws. Miss Beakley as a pure voice of reason character is really boring.
Her whole purpose seems to be being the one to stop the trouble, though.
But the whole point of the show isn't to stop trouble from happening, it's to get out of trouble when it does happen. But then there's Webby.
Webby is probably the most pointless main character in the whole show from the original.
Especially considering that this episode, the episode where she actually does something productive, she serves as a second fiddle to a random fucking penguin that we never see again. It feels like she's just random girl child duck so that we can have girl child duck in the show. I feel like the boys are kind of right to call her a tag-along.
Hell, in the 5th episode, she serves the role I like to call the exposition sponge.
Which is a role that literally everyone can play in that situation. Hell, you don't even need a character for that. Miss Beakley can just monologue about what's going to shit.
In the reboot, both characters are given much more proactive capabilities.
Because if you're going to send these people into the fray, at least make them somewhat capable.
Webby's a much more interesting character in the new version, what with her obsession with Scrooge's legacy.
Which, interestingly enough, shifts her from being an exposition sponge to the person giving the exposition in some cases. Thanks to her expertise,
Beakley still just the voice of reason, but with a more adventure-capable bent.
And perhaps one of the more interesting things is the character that she kind of combines with, who I didn't talk about for a reason.
See, Scrooge's butler, Ducksworth, is completely inconsequential, so Beakley fills that role in addition to being a nanny in the new series.
With a bit more of an attitude, just to give the character a little bit more personality than just generic grandma number 876. It's a great change.
I'm willing to admit that the penguins obsessed with colors thing from this episode is certainly an interesting concept to work with.
Although in my personal opinion, I feel like it could have been executed better. Especially with the ending.
So the whole point is the fact that the penguins took them out to the temple from Scrooge.
And Webby does play a role in resolving this, although, admittedly, this is probably one of the weakest Chekhov's guns in this entire 5-episode arc at the very least.
At the beginning of the episode, Webby was coloring a picture with crayons that,
Despite not being seen in any capacity on her person when she boarded the plane on the flight to Antarctica,
she uses to create a replica of the map.
and yeah, that's technically an example of Webby being useful, but it feels a lot more like an out-of-character moment. Especially when you really think about it, because isn't the whole point of her character is that she's more innocent and childlike than the boys? So why would she have the forethought to come up with that? Especially as quickly as she needed to.
Episode 5, for lack of a better term, serves as kind of a cash-in to Scrooge's own greed.
Because we all know he hasn't. We saw it right at the beginning of the series. And you know, you could very well say that during this arc he's learned from his enemies' mistakes more so than his own. Basically seeing their hubris and seeing what greed gets you. However, what this does is show that Scrooge isn't exactly immune to these problems.
The crux of the whole episode is this concept of gold fever.
Which is one of those fictional diseases with kind of weird, symptoms. Although some of these symptoms actually do kind of tie in with the greed, itching for gold and stuff like that.
El Capitan returns, showing signs of gold fever after it's explained.
Which is a nice touch, but I do feel like having these gold fever ticks come sooner would serve as a better through line, and this would be a good payoff for that. And it would kind of show that Scrooge is not really immune to the same vices that his enemies suffer from. And, it would be a subtle way to add a little bit of complication to the story that doesn't really take away from the experience for, a kid watching, but does add to the experience for an adult or an analyst. Like, hi.
So this is also the episode where we get the reveal of El Capitan being around for about 400 years.
And I'm not a big fan of the explanation here. Okay, so the reason that he stayed alive for 400 years is sheer willpower. Are you fucking serious right now?
Okay, in the very next episode, we're gonna get introduced to a witch whose brother was turned into a raven. You mean to tell me that saying that there was some kind of magic involved was out of the equation?
This dumb explanation also kind of wastes a potential recurring villain, too. Well, then again, the lack of magic doesn't really stop him from being a recurring villain.
The ending just has him digging for the gold.
So it's not like he comes anywhere close to dying. I mean, sure, I have a little bit of a problem with this, but it's not like I didn't like what we got out of it. That's the thing about this show. I mean, I do have problems with this initial story arc, but that doesn't mean I didn't enjoy it. I really did. That's something that I think some people have a tendency to miss. Most notable example of this coming when I criticize Samurai Jack's ending. Yeah, I can have a problem with something and still love it. I can find flaws but still really enjoy it. You know what I mean? And that's kind of what happens here. And I feel like that's also what the reboot does. I mean, the reboot does address a lot of things in the original show and changes them. And part of what happens there is thanks to the modernization of using more, modern storytelling tactics. They're able to take what the original series did in 5 episodes and do it in the length of 2. It introduces the same major characters that were introduced in the original series. It does the same narrative of Scrooge starting out not really liking the other characters all that much to going on adventures with them. And it even uses the same major recurring villain in Glom Gold. And the difference being Glom Gold is legitimately the main villain here as opposed to petering out only a little bit into the arc and really only showing up and really only having any kind of presence in one episode. There's a couple of reasons why I feel like this reboot was able to take less time doing the same thing. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that, it was willing to criticize the original. It was willing to take what the original did and do something different with it. It spent less time on interpersonal drama, but the writing involved with the interpersonal drama was better. There were a couple of reasons for this, be it, giving a little bit more nuance to individual parts of what's going on, a couple of things with facial expressions that weren't done at the time. And that's just it. That right there indicates why this reboot was both wanted and necessary. Was the original show good? You bet your ass it was. Has the original show aged? Well, definitely more gracefully than other stuff from the time, but yeah, I'd say that its age kind of shows to a certain extent. And having a new version that shows a little bit more understanding to narrative structure and things like that really is helpful. Matter of fact, I believe this is the type of reboot that a lot of other reboots should aspire to be. You take the concepts of the original, you follow the spirit of the original, as opposed to trying to follow the letter. And when you do that, what winds up happening is that you're able to present new ideas with familiar characters. Now let's just see how many of these comments are going to be death threats because I said DuckTales wasn't perfect.